To die of freezing in the Arctic is a slow, quiet process. You fall asleep and never wake up. But when a Dutch whaling ship discovered the frozen wreckage of the British galleon Vanguard in 1614, the crew hadn't frozen to death. The galleon was encased in a mountain of solid ice. But inside, the ship had been systematically torched. The crew had barricaded the heavy oak doors from the inside, poured their remaining whale oil over the decks, and burned themselves alive. They chose the most agonizing death possible over the cold. The Dutch captain found only one surviving document, the surgeon's logbook, hidden inside a sealed lead powder keg. The final entry didn't mention starvation or scurvy or the cold. It contained a warning, written in a hand shaking with absolute terror. "Do not dig the black meat from the ice. It is not dead. It is just hungry." In the early 17th century, the map of the world was full of blank spaces filled with monsters. The greatest prize for the British crown was finding the Northwest Passage, a mythical route through the Arctic to the riches of Asia. In May 1612, the galleon Vanguard set sail from London. It was a massive fortress of oak and iron, commanded by Captain Thomas Stirling. He had a crew of 65 men, hardened sailors, musketeers, and a surgeon named Silas Thorne. They sailed north, farther north than any chart allowed. By late September, the Arctic winter did not just arrive, it slammed shut like a steel trap. The ocean around the Vanguard froze solid within 48 hours. The hull groaned as thousands of tons of ice squeezed the wood. They were trapped, a tiny wooden speck in an endless, blinding white desert. Surgeon Thorne's journal describes the first 2 months. They survived on salted pork and hardtack. But as the perpetual darkness of the polar night set in, the cold began to take its toll. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The ship's interior was a freezing, damp cave. Without fresh meat, scurvy began to rot their gums and loosen their teeth. By December, the rations were nearly gone. Death was a mathematical certainty. But on December 14th, a hunting party searching for polar bears found an anomaly on the ice shelf. It was a massive mound of dark, discolored ice, looming like a black cathedral against the white horizon. Through the clear layers of ice, they could see something colossal frozen inside. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a whale. It was a mass of dense, black, oily flesh. Captain Stirling, facing the starvation of his crew, made the only logical choice a 17th century commander could make. He ordered his men to take pickaxes and chop the meat out of the ice. They thought God had provided them with a miracle, a leviathan preserved in the cold, ready to save them. Butchering the creature was a nightmare. The flesh blunted their axes. It had a strange, rubbery texture, and it didn't bleed red. It oozed a thick, dark sap that smelled of iron and ozone. They hauled tons of this black meat into the lower hold of the Vanguard. That night, the ship's cook boiled the meat in massive iron cauldrons. The smell permeated the oak walls, a heavy, sweet, metallic scent that made the dogs on board whine and pace nervously. The starving men devoured it. Thorne noted in his journal that the meat was incredibly rich. It generated intense, immediate body heat. The shivering stopped. The men's pale skin flushed red. For a week, the ship was a happy place. The men felt stronger than they had in months. The scurvy reversed. But in 1612, humanity knew nothing about cellular biology. They didn't know that extreme cold doesn't always kill. Sometimes it just puts things to sleep. By the second week of January, the psychological atmosphere on the Vanguard shifted. It started with the silence. Usually, a trapped ship is noisy with complaints, prayers, and arguments. But Thorne noticed the lower decks had become unnervingly quiet. Men stopped playing cards. They stopped talking. They just sat in the dark, staring at the walls, wrapped in thick wool coats. Then came the physical anomalies. Thorne was summoned to the hold to treat a sailor named Higgins, who had crushed his hand between two barrels. When Thorne removed the bloody bandages, he stopped breathing. The crushed bones hadn't healed. The missing tissue had been replaced by a thick, dark, fibrous mass. It pulsed slightly, in a rhythm that did not match Higgins's heartbeat. Higgins didn't complain of pain. He just looked at Thorne with dead, glassy eyes and whispered, "I am so warm, Doctor. We are all so warm." The paranoia began to spread like the frost on the windows. Men started wearing their heavy scarves and masks even while sleeping, hiding their faces, hiding their necks. They stopped sleeping in groups, because at night, the sound of the ship creaking was joined by a new sound. A wet, tearing sound, like wet leather being stretched, coming from the shadows of the bunks. The men realized they were trapped in a wooden box with people who were no longer completely human. In modern times, we would call this an alien parasite, a cellular assimilation. But to the deeply religious men of the 17th century, this was witchcraft. It was demonic possession. Captain Sterling ordered the remaining uninfected men to arm themselves, but the Arctic cold had a final, cruel trick to play. At 40 degrees below zero, the flintlock muskets became useless. The black powder froze. The flint wouldn't spark. They were reduced to swords, heavy boarding axes, and pikes. The ship descended into a medieval witch hunt inside an icebox. Thorne's diary details the primitive testing methods they devised. They realized the assimilated tissue reacted violently to severe heat. They forced the crew to line up in the freezing galley. One by one, they pressed a red-hot iron poker against each man's bare forearm. If a man screamed and his flesh blistered, he was human. But when they pressed the iron to the ship's quartermaster, he didn't scream. His flesh didn't burn. The dark, oily tissue underneath moved. It recoiled from the heat like a living serpent beneath his skin. What happened next was pure slaughter. The quartermaster's jaw unhinged, revealing layers of jagged, dark cartilage. He tore through 3 men before Sterling decapitated him with a broadsword. But decapitation wasn't enough. The head, lying on the frost-covered floor, continued to move. The dark blood began to weave new connections, trying to pull itself back together. The infected didn't need the ship's rations anymore. They had stopped speaking English. They communicated in low, vibrating frequencies that resonated in the frozen wood of the hull. The final entry of the conflict is a terrifying testament to human desperation. Sterling and the last 8 human survivors barricaded themselves in the captain's quarters. Outside the oak door, the rest of the crew, the things that used to be their friends, were waiting. They weren't breaking the door down. They were simply leaning against it, generating a sickening, unnatural heat that was melting the frost on the inside of the cabin. Thorne wrote, "They are waiting for us to starve, or freeze. They know we cannot stay in here forever. I can hear Higgins whispering through the keyhole. He says it doesn't hurt. He says the black ice is a choir, and they want us to sing." Captain Sterling understood that swords could not kill it, and he knew that if spring ever came and the ice thawed, the Vanguard would eventually drift out of the Arctic, bringing the Leviathan's blood to the ports of Europe. He chose the only weapon that worked: fire. The survivors used the last of their dry gunpowder to create explosive charges around the whale oil reserves in the lower decks. They locked the heavy iron grates on the stairwells to trap the infected below. Then, they lit the fuses. The fire burned the Vanguard from the inside out. It consumed the wood, the men, and the black flesh. The heat was so intense it partially melted the ice cave around them, before the extreme Arctic winter quickly froze the water back over the charred hull, sealing it in a perfect tomb. In 1614, the Dutch whalers tried to chop into the wreckage, hoping to salvage gold. But when they reached the lower decks, they found the wood was stained deep black, and the smell of ozone was still there. The Dutch captain read Thorne's diary, immediately ordered his men off the ice, and abandoned the site entirely. The exact coordinates of the Vanguard were deliberately left out of the official maritime records. Somewhere in the vast, shifting ice shelves of the Arctic, that scorched wooden tomb is still slowly drifting. With modern global warming melting the polar ice caps at a record pace, layers of permafrost that have been frozen for millions of years are being exposed. What else is sleeping in the black ice? And what happens when it finally thaws? Now, I have a question for you. If you were freezing to death in the dark and your captain offered you the black meat, would you take a bite, hoping to survive, or choose to freeze as a human? Leave your choice in the comments below. The most honest answers will get pinned. If this journey into the cold dark sent a shiver down your spine, hit that like button. It keeps our fires burning. And subscribe to Static Archive for more unclassified nightmares. Stay warm and watch what you eat.